The morning arrived cold and bright over the village of Ashworth, a small settlement in the English countryside where time seemed to move at its own slow pace. The narrow stone streets had been swept clean the night before, and every house displayed fresh flower boxes in their windows, a detail that mattered greatly when hosting someone of importance. The Duke's visit had been announced 3 weeks earlier, and since then the entire community had worked tirelessly to ensure everything looked perfect for his arrival. Thomas Hendricks stood with his grandfather near the village square, watching the preparations unfold around them. The boy was only 9 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that refused to stay flat no matter how many times his mother tried to comb it down. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, the only proper one he owned, and his eyes tracked every movement in the square with quiet curiosity. His grandfather, Albert Hendricks, had worked in stables his entire life, first for a large estate in Yorkshire, then later for smaller farms around Ashworth after his knees gave him too much trouble to continue the heavy work. The old man's hands were gnarled and weathered, but his mind remained sharp, especially when it came to horses. "Stop fidgeting, Tom," his grandfather said quietly, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You'll wear a hole in your jacket." Thomas stopped moving, but continued watching as workers arranged wooden barriers along the route where the Duke would walk. A small platform had been constructed near the old oak tree in the center of the square, draped with dark blue fabric and decorated with the regional crest. Local officials stood in small clusters, checking their pocket watches and speaking in low, serious tones. The tension in the air was unmistakable, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that affected everyone, from the mayor to the shopkeepers who had closed their stores for the morning. The Duke was visiting to inspect a new agricultural cooperative that had been established with partial funding from his estate. It was meant to be a quick visit, no more than an hour, but for the people of Ashworth, it represented something far more significant. Most of them had never seen nobility up close, and the prospect of speaking to someone with such power and influence felt both thrilling and intimidating. Thomas's mother, Claire, appeared from behind them carrying a small basket covered with a clean cloth. She looked tired, her face pale from lack of sleep, but she had dressed carefully in her best dark dress and had pinned her hair up neatly. "Tom, Albert, stay close to me when he arrives," she said firmly. "I don't want you getting lost in the crowd." "We won't go anywhere, Claire," Albert assured her, though Thomas noticed his grandfather's gaze had shifted toward the road leading into the village, where a line of black automobiles was now visible in the distance. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd as the vehicles approached. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders for a better view, and the local photographer positioned himself near the platform, adjusting his camera with nervous hands. The mayor, a heavy-set man named Mr. Crawley, straightened his tie for what must have been the 10th time, and cleared his throat loudly, rehearsing his greeting under his breath. The first car rolled to a smooth stop near the square, followed closely by 2 others. Security personnel emerged first, scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency before opening the rear door of the middle vehicle. The Duke stepped out, a tall man in his early 50s with silver-grey hair and a composed expression that revealed nothing of what he might be thinking. He wore a dark, tailored suit and moved with the kind of ease that came from a lifetime of public appearances. Behind him came his secretary, a younger man carrying a leather folder, and 2 additional staff members whose roles were less obvious. The crowd erupted in polite applause as the Duke approached the platform. Mayor Crawley stepped forward, extending his hand with a wide smile. "Your Grace, welcome to Ashworth. It is an honor to have you here." The Duke shook his hand briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Crawley. I'm pleased to finally see the cooperative in person." The mayor launched into a prepared speech, describing the history of the village and the importance of the cooperative to the local economy. Thomas watched the Duke's face carefully, noticing how his expression remained neutral but attentive, nodding at appropriate moments, but offering little visible reaction. It was the kind of politeness that felt practiced, professional, but distant. After the speech concluded, the Duke was led on a brief tour of the square, stopping to shake hands with selected community members who had been positioned along the route. Thomas's family was not among them, standing instead near the back of the crowd where ordinary residents gathered. The boy noticed how the Duke's security personnel maintained a subtle but constant presence around him, their eyes always moving, always assessing. Then came the moment that would shift everything. One of the Duke's staff members brought forward a magnificent chestnut horse, its coat gleaming in the morning sun. The animal had been transported in a trailer, specifically for this visit, as the Duke preferred to ride through the village and out to the cooperative site, rather than take a car for the final stretch. It was meant to be a symbolic gesture, connecting tradition with progress, and the photographers immediately moved closer to capture the image. Thomas felt his grandfather stiffen beside him. Albert's eyes had locked onto the horse, studying its movements as it was led forward. The animal seemed agitated, its ears flicking back and forth, its head tossing slightly despite the handler's firm grip on the reins. "Something's not right," Albert muttered, so quietly that only Thomas heard him. The boy looked up at his grandfather, then back at the horse. The Duke was removing his jacket, handing it to his secretary, preparing to mount. The crowd pressed forward slightly, eager to see the moment. Thomas felt his heart begin to beat faster, though he didn't yet understand why. His grandfather's decades of experience with horses had taught the old man to read animals in ways others couldn't, and the concern in his voice made Thomas look more carefully at the scene unfolding before them. The saddle sat on the horse's back, the leather dark and polished. The stirrups hung at the correct length. Everything appeared normal to the untrained eye, but Albert's expression had grown increasingly troubled, his weathered face tightening with worry as the Duke stepped closer to the horse, reaching for the reins. Thomas felt his grandfather's hand tighten on his shoulder, and the old man leaned down to whisper urgently in his ear. "Tom, look at the girth strap. Do you see how loose it is? And the way the saddle sits, it's not properly secured." The boy squinted, trying to see what his grandfather meant. The crowd was pressing forward, voices rising with excitement as the Duke stepped closer to the horse. Thomas could hear people commenting on how magnificent the animal looked, how elegant the Duke appeared in his riding clothes. But all Thomas could focus on was his grandfather's worried breathing and the subtle wrongness of the scene before them. "The buckle," Albert continued, his voice tight. "It's been adjusted incorrectly. If he mounts that horse and the animal moves suddenly, the saddle will shift. He'll fall, Tom. At his age, from that height on these stone streets, it could be terrible." Thomas looked up at his grandfather's weathered face and saw genuine fear there. Albert had seen accidents before, had witnessed what happened when equipment failed and horses panicked. The old man's instincts were rarely wrong when it came to animals, and the urgency in his voice sent a jolt of alarm through the boy's chest. The Duke was now standing directly beside the horse, one hand reaching for the pommel of the saddle. His security personnel had stepped back slightly, giving him space for the photographers. The handler held the reins steady, but Thomas noticed what his grandfather had seen. The horse's continued agitation, the way its weight kept shifting from hoof to hoof, the tension visible in its neck and shoulders. "We have to tell someone," Thomas said, his voice small and uncertain. "Who's going to listen to us?" Albert replied bitterly. "Look around, boy. We're nobody here. By the time we get through this crowd to someone official, he'll already be mounted." Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. The voices around them grew louder, more excited. Someone near them said, "He's about to get on." A woman laughed nervously. Children were lifted higher on shoulders. The mayor stood beaming beside the platform, clearly pleased with how the event was unfolding. The Duke placed his left foot in the stirrup, preparing to swing himself up onto the horse's back. Something inside Thomas broke loose, a kind of desperate courage he didn't know he possessed. Without thinking, without planning, he pulled away from his grandfather's grip and pushed forward through the crowd, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Wait! Don't get on the horse!" His voice cracked on the last word, high and sharp with panic. Several people turned to look at him, confused expressions on their faces. Thomas kept pushing forward, squeezing between adults who were too surprised to stop him immediately. "Don't get on the horse!" he shouted again, louder this time. "The saddle isn't safe!" The crowd began to quiet, a ripple of confusion spreading outward from where Thomas stood. The Duke had paused, his foot still in the stirrup, turning his head to locate the source of the disruption. Security personnel immediately moved forward, their faces tight with professional concern, scanning for any threat. Thomas's mother appeared behind him, her face flushed with horror and embarrassment. "Tom, what are you doing?" she hissed, trying to pull him back. "Stop this right now!" But Albert had followed his grandson through the crowd and now stood beside the boy, his hand on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture of support rather than restraint. "The boy's right," the old man said, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. "There's something wrong with that saddle." Mayor Crawley's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He stepped forward, gesturing angrily at the Hendricks family. "This is completely inappropriate. Remove these people immediately." One of the security officers approached Thomas and his grandfather, his hand outstretched to guide them away. But the Duke had removed his foot from the stirrup and was now looking directly at them, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, nobody moved. The horse stamped nervously, tossing its head, and the sound of its hoofs striking the cobblestones seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "What did you say about the saddle?" the Duke asked, his voice calm but commanding enough to carry across the square. Thomas felt every eye in the village turned toward him. His face burned with embarrassment, and his throat felt tight, but his grandfather's steady presence beside him gave him the courage to speak. "The girth strap, sir. It's not properly secured. My grandfather worked in stables his whole life. He says if you mount the horse and it moves suddenly, the saddle will shift and you'll fall." The Duke studied Thomas for a moment, then turned to look at Albert. "You have experience with horses?" 40 years, Your Grace," Albert replied, his voice respectful but firm. "I know what a properly secured saddle looks like, and that one isn't right. The buckle's been adjusted incorrectly, and the whole thing sits too loose on the animal's back." The Duke's secretary moved forward, whispering something urgent in his employer's ear, probably advising him to dismiss the interruption and continue with the schedule. But the Duke raised one hand, silencing him, and gestured to the head of his security detail. "Check the saddle, thoroughly." The security officer looked momentarily uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the implication that they had missed something important during their preparations. But he moved forward to examine the equipment while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The handler shifted nervously, still holding the reins, his face pale with growing worry. The officer ran his hands carefully along the girth strap, checking the buckles and the way the saddle sat on the horse's back. His movements became slower, more deliberate, and Thomas saw his expression change from skepticism to concern. He turned to speak quietly with another member of the security team, then straightened and approached the Duke. "Your Grace," he said, his voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear, "the boy and his grandfather are correct. The girth is dangerously loose, and there are irregularities with how it was fastened. I need to have our equipment specialist examine this immediately." The atmosphere in the village square shifted dramatically in the moments following the security officer's confirmation. What had been a celebratory public event suddenly transformed into a tense, uncomfortable scene, as the reality of what had nearly happened began to sink in. The Duke stepped away from the horse, his composed expression never faltering, but Thomas noticed how the man's jaw had tightened and how his eyes had taken on a harder, more focused quality. Within minutes, additional security personnel had surrounded the horse and its equipment, creating a barrier that pushed the crowd back. The mayor, who had been so confidently orchestrating the event just moments before, now stood to the side looking lost and anxious, clearly uncertain about what his role should be in this unexpected crisis. The photographers had lowered their cameras, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would not be appropriate for public documentation. Thomas stood with his grandfather and mother, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. Some people looked at them with gratitude and respect, recognizing that the boy had potentially saved the Duke from serious injury. Others regarded them with suspicion or resentment, as if they had deliberately sabotaged what should have been a smooth, prestigious event for the village. Claire kept her arm around Thomas's shoulders, her face pale but her posture protective, while Albert watched the investigation unfold with the careful attention of someone who understood the seriousness of what they had discovered. The Duke's equipment specialist, a compact man with graying hair and efficient movements, had arrived from one of the other vehicles and was now conducting a methodical examination of the saddle, the girth, and the horse itself. He worked in silence for several minutes while everyone watched, occasionally conferring in low tones with the head of security. Finally, he straightened and approached the Duke, gesturing for him to step away from the crowd for a private conversation. Thomas couldn't hear what was being said, but he watched the Duke's expression carefully. The man listened intently, asked several questions, and then turned to look back at the horse with an expression that Thomas thought might be carefully controlled anger. After another brief exchange, the Duke nodded, and the specialist moved to speak with other members of the security team. The Duke returned to where Thomas and his family stood, and the crowd quieted immediately, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Mayor Crawley tried to insert himself into the conversation, but the Duke raised a hand, politely but firmly excluding him from the discussion. "Mr. Hendricks," the Duke said, addressing Albert directly, "my specialist confirms your assessment. The girth strap was improperly fastened in a way that would have caused the saddle to shift dangerously once weight was placed on it and the horse began to move. He also tells me that the way it was done suggests either gross negligence or deliberate tampering." Albert nodded slowly. "The buckle tongue was threaded incorrectly through the holes, Your Grace. It would hold initially, but with movement and pressure it would slip. And the adjustment, someone shortened the strap on one side more than the other, which would make the saddle rotate as well as slide." "Could this have been accidental?" the Duke asked. "The incorrect threading, possibly, though unlikely for anyone with proper training," Albert replied. "But the uneven adjustment combined with it, that's harder to explain as simple mistake." The Duke was silent for a moment, then turned his attention to Thomas. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been with the adults. "Young man, what made you speak up? Many people would have been too frightened to interrupt in front of such a crowd." Thomas felt his face grow hot again, but he forced himself to meet the Duke's eyes. "My grandfather taught me about horses, sir. When he said something was wrong, I believed him, and I thought if I didn't say something and you got hurt, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a softening around his eyes that suggested genuine appreciation. "You showed remarkable courage. Both of you did." He paused, then added, "I want you to know that this matter will be investigated thoroughly. Someone will be held accountable." Within the hour, the village square had been cleared, and the Duke's entire staff had been assembled in a private room at the local community hall. Thomas and his family were asked to remain available for questioning, along with several other witnesses who had been near the horse before the Duke's arrival. The celebratory atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by an air of suspicion and anxiety that hung over everyone involved. The investigation moved quickly because the number of people who had access to the horse and its equipment was limited. The animal had been transported in a specialized trailer and had been handled by only a small team: the primary handler, an assistant, and 2 members of the Duke's staff who were responsible for maintaining his riding equipment. All 4 were questioned separately by the Duke's head of security and a senior member of his household staff who had experience handling internal disciplinary matters. Thomas sat with his mother and grandfather in a small waiting room, drinking tea that someone had brought them and listening to the muted conversations happening behind closed doors. At one point, raised voices could be heard. Someone insisting they had done everything correctly, someone else pointing out inconsistencies in that claim. The tension was palpable, and Thomas felt simultaneously proud of what he had done and troubled by the consequences that were now unfolding around them. As evening approached, the head of security emerged and spoke briefly with the Duke before approaching the Hendricks family. "We've identified the source of the problem," he said quietly. "The primary handler, a man named Robert Finch, made the adjustments to the saddle this morning. Under questioning, he initially claimed he followed standard procedures, but when confronted with the physical evidence and testimony from his assistant, his story changed. He admits he was distracted and rushed, trying to manage multiple tasks at once, and that he may have made mistakes. However, the nature of the mistakes and certain other irregularities we've discovered suggest this may not have been entirely accidental." "What kind of irregularities?" Albert asked. The security officer hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. "Mr. Finch has worked for the Duke's estate for 3 years. His performance reviews have been adequate, but not exceptional. About 6 months ago, he was passed over for a promotion to head groom, a position that went to someone else. Since then, according to other staff members, he's made several bitter comments about feeling undervalued and disrespected. When we searched his belongings, we found evidence that he's been in significant debt and had recently inquired about positions with other employers but hadn't received any offers." "No, sir, so he was resentful and desperate," Claire said quietly. "That's the working theory," the officer confirmed. "Whether he deliberately sabotaged the saddle intending to cause an accident, or whether he simply became careless due to his emotional state and financial stress, we're still determining. Either way, his negligence nearly resulted in serious harm to the Duke." Thomas felt a complicated mixture of emotions. He had prevented something terrible from happening, but now a man's life and career were being destroyed, and a whole network of trust and security had been exposed as fragile and flawed. It wasn't the clear-cut victory he had imagined when he first shouted his warning across the square. The news of what had happened in Ashworth spread with remarkable speed. By the following morning, regional newspapers carried stories about the brave boy who saved a duke, and by afternoon, national media outlets had picked up the narrative. Reporters appeared in the village, seeking interviews with Thomas, his family, and anyone else who had witnessed the event. The Duke's office released a carefully worded statement acknowledging the incident, praising Thomas's quick thinking, and confirming that an internal investigation was underway regarding security and equipment handling procedures. Thomas's life changed almost overnight in ways he hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely welcome. He woke the morning after the incident to find 3 journalists and a television crew standing outside his family's modest house, waiting to speak with him. His mother, protective and overwhelmed, tried to shield him from the attention, but the pressure was relentless. The school headmaster called to discuss how to manage the situation when Thomas returned to classes. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged the Hendricks family before suddenly appeared with congratulations and requests to share their connection to the hero of Ashworth. Albert handled the attention with weary resignation, giving brief statements to a few reporters but refusing most interview requests. "I just saw what needed to be seen," he told one persistent journalist. "Any person with proper training would have noticed the same thing. The boy had the courage to speak up, that's all." But the media wasn't interested in modest explanations. They wanted drama, heroism, and a feel-good story about a working-class child saving aristocratic privilege, which created its own uncomfortable ironies that weren't lost on the family. The Duke, to his credit, didn't disappear after the incident. 2 days later, he returned to Ashworth specifically to meet privately with the Hendricks family at their home. He arrived without the entourage and ceremony of his first visit, accompanied only by his secretary and one security officer. Claire had cleaned the house thoroughly, though there was no hiding its worn furniture and modest circumstances, and she stood nervously as the Duke entered their small sitting room. "Thank you for receiving me," the Duke said, settling into the chair Claire offered. "I wanted to speak with you personally, away from the cameras and the public spectacle this has unfortunately become." "You don't need to thank us, Your Grace," Claire said quietly. "Tom did what any decent person would do." "Perhaps," the Duke replied, "but many decent people lack the courage to act on what they know is right, especially when it means disrupting authority or drawing attention to themselves. Your son showed both knowledge and bravery, and you should be proud of him." He turned to Thomas. "I also wanted you to hear directly from me what has happened as a result of the investigation." Thomas sat up straighter, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. "Is Mr. Finch in trouble, sir?" "Mr. Finch has been dismissed from my employment," the Duke said evenly. "The investigation concluded that while we cannot definitively prove intent to cause harm, his negligence was severe, and his explanations for how the errors occurred were inconsistent and unconvincing. Combined with evidence of his resentment toward his supervisors and his attempts to conceal the full extent of his mistakes, termination was the appropriate consequence." "Will he face criminal charges?" Albert asked. "That remains under consideration," the Duke replied. "My legal advisors are reviewing the matter. At minimum, his dismissal and the circumstances behind it will make finding similar employment extremely difficult for him." Thomas felt a knot in his stomach. He hadn't liked the idea of someone being hurt because of faulty equipment, but he also didn't enjoy knowing that his actions had resulted in a man losing his job and possibly facing worse consequences. The Duke seemed to sense his discomfort. "You're troubled by this outcome," the Duke observed. "That speaks well of your character, but you should understand something important. You didn't create this situation. Mr. Finch made choices that put my safety at risk, whether through deliberate malice or dangerous carelessness. What you did was prevent those choices from having catastrophic consequences. The responsibility for his circumstances lies with him, not with you." The Duke reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "I also wanted to give you this personally." He handed it to Claire. "It's not meant as payment for what your family did. That would be inappropriate and insufficient, but I would like to establish an educational fund for Thomas and provide a pension supplement for Mr. Hendricks in recognition of his years of service in stables and his expertise that proved invaluable." Claire opened the envelope with trembling hands and stared at the contents. Thomas couldn't see what was written there, but he saw his mother's eyes widen and then fill with tears. "Your Grace, this is too generous." "It's appropriate," the Duke corrected gently. "Your family prevented what could have been not just a personal tragedy, but a public disaster that would have reflected poorly on everyone involved in organizing the visit." More importantly, this incident has revealed serious flaws in how my household handles security and equipment oversight. You've given me the opportunity to address those problems before they cause actual harm. That's worth considerably more than what's in that envelope. Over the following weeks, Thomas discovered that fame, even small, local fame, was more complicated than he'd imagined. At school, some classmates treated him like a celebrity, constantly asking him to retell the story and seeking his company in ways they never had before. Others resented the attention he received, calling him a show-off or suggesting he'd exaggerated what had happened. Teachers didn't seem to know how to treat him, oscillating between pride in his actions and visible discomfort with the disruption his newfound notoriety brought to their classrooms. The financial assistance from the Duke made a significant difference to the family's circumstances. Claire was able to reduce her hours at one of her 2 jobs without sacrificing their ability to pay bills. Albert could afford better medication for his knee pain and could visit a specialist he'd been putting off seeing due to cost. Thomas's future education, which had been a source of worry and vague plans, now had concrete support behind it. These were genuine, meaningful improvements that the family acknowledged with gratitude. But there were costs, too. Some long-time neighbors grew distant, their interactions tinged with envy or awkwardness about the economic gap that had suddenly widened between the Hendricks family and others in their community. Thomas's mother received a few nasty anonymous letters suggesting she had orchestrated the entire incident to extract money from the Duke. Accusations that were absurd, but still hurt. The family's privacy had been permanently compromised, their faces and story now part of public record and local legend. Thomas thought often about Mr. Finch, the handler who had lost everything because of mistakes made on a single morning. He didn't regret speaking up. He knew his grandfather had been right and that someone could have been badly hurt. But he learned that doing the right thing didn't always feel triumphant or simple. Sometimes it just felt necessary and complicated, with consequences that rippled outward in ways you couldn't fully anticipate or control.